Hello, and welcome to Game Gems. Today, we're going to take a quick look at a fairly straightforward, but no less handy, technique to populate scroll containers by scanning a directory in the file system. How many times has this happened to you? You've got a bunch of levels, and you've defined them all as scene files, as well you should, but now you want to create a level select dialog, but you don't want to have to remember to manually add each level to the dialog when you, or your level designer, finishes it. Or maybe you've got a list of saved games you want to let the player select from, or any number of 100 other use cases that I'm sure you're thinking of right now. Knowing how to interface with the contents of a directory in Godot, as well as dynamically populate various UI containers, is one of the most important things you can learn how to do in terms of productivity. So let's see how it's done. We're going to create a dialog that scans a folder within the project looking for Godot scenes, then populate a scroll container with those scenes and wire them up for interaction so that when the user clicks on one, something happens. I've already created a new project and created some basic scenes that are literally just Sprite 2Ds with the Godot logo, of course, saved with different file names in a data directory off of my project root. Then I created a scene that consists of a panel container that contains a margin container, wrapping VBox container, and that VBox container in turn contains a scroll container, and that scroll container has an empty VBox container as its child. Wow. The scroll container's vertical sizing is set to expand so that it will fill the entirety of the margin container, but the VBox is set to fill because we want it to only be as large as the total length of its children. The top level VBox container also contains a button so we can interact with our clicked on object. Now we'll add a script to our scroll container. It doesn't need a class name, but you can give it one if you want. I usually name all of my classes so that if I ever need to cast a reference to one, it'll enable autocomplete. Within that script, we'll define an array. It doesn't need to be exportable, but we'll define a setter method. If you're not familiar with setters, they're functions that get called when a variable's value changes, and is responsible for the actual changing of that value. We want to update the visible contents of the scroll container when this array is assigned a value. For now, let's just assign the passed-in value to the array. We need to do one more thing before we can populate the scroll container. Add an exportable variable of type packed_scene to your script. This variable will hold the scene prefab that will instantiate to create each visible element of our list. Now let's create it. We're going to get moderately fancy and use a button as our scene with the horizontal layout set to expand. This, as you may know, will force the button to resize itself to fill the entirety of its parent in the horizontal direction. Save the scene, and once you have it, drag it into your prefab variable in the inspector so that Godot will auto-magically load the resource for you. We're also going to need to define the folder path that we want the component to read, so let's add an exportable variable of type export directory and assign it to the folder we're going to scan. After we do that, let's define a new method to scan the directory. We could just combine this with the array assignment, but it's good practice to keep your various bits of functionality separate. That way, for example, if you want this array to auto-populate from a different source, it'll be easier to do if you don't have to separate the directory scanning logic from the array assignment logic. The main reason you do that is if you wanted a generic UI component that could populate from sources other than a directory, but I digress. Let's use the DirAccess class to open our exported directory path and then check if the return result is false. If it is, we screwed up somewhere. If not, we can start looking through the directory. We do that with the list_dir_begin method, which does some magic under the hood that I don't pretend to understand. What I do know is that if we call the getNext method afterwards, we'll get the first item within the directory listing. The problem is, directories contain both subdirectories and files, and in this particular case, we don't care about subdirectories. So first we check if the file name is blank, which means we've hit the end of the list, and if it's not, we check if it's a directory by using the current_is_dir method on the directory object itself. If this method returns false and we don't have a blank file name, we have a file to play with. What do we want to do with this file name? Well, two things. We want to create a new button with said file name, but we also want to interact with the file when the player presses that button. We'll do those in the array setter, but in order to do that, we need an array of file names. Let's define an empty string array and add the file name to it. When we're done with that, we call getNext again to move on to the next item in the directory. Finally, we return the array of strings. We'll use that return value to feed our setter. When do we do that? Well, it depends on your game. I usually have some kind of show method that initializes the UI component and then shows it, but here we can just do it in the ready method. Simply assign the array to the return value of the function we just wrote and the setter will do the rest. And speaking of the setter, first thing it'll need to do is clear out any previous contents. So simply loop through the container variable's children and remove them all prior to calling queue_free. We explicitly remove them because queue_free doesn't always run immediately and we don't want any collisions or redundant data. Next, we assign the input value to the array. Once we've done that, we can loop through all the elements of the array to create our new list. Within that loop, for each file name, we need to instantiate a copy of our button prefab and assign it to a variable, casting it to a button so Godot knows what it's intended to be. This enables autocomplete and other type checking, which, while not necessary, is still handy. Then we assign the text of the button to the file name using the substring method to shave the extension off of the end. Once we've done that, we add the button to the ScrollContainers VBox child. Next, we need a variable to hold the last button the player clicked on, so we can interact with it when the relevant UI button is pressed. Once we've done that, we can use the connect method to attach a lambda function to each new button's pressed signal, and that lambda function assigns the relevant array element to the holder variable, because when we click on the button, we want to interact with the array element the button points to, not the button itself. Finally, we attach a script to the pressed signal of our interaction button. Within it, we check if our holder variable is null, which indicates that we haven't clicked on a list element yet. If it's not null, we simply echo the value of the list element to confirm we've got the right one. In a more complex game, we'd actually do something with the list element, like maybe load it as a level or something. Another thing you can do to add a little bit of polish is to simply have the interact button start as disabled and then enable it once a button has been clicked on within its lambda function. And that's it. Converting the contents of a directory to a UI component has so many uses, it's not even funny. So get out there and start scanning those folders. Be sure to take a break to smash the like button, subscribe to this channel, and go sign up for my Patreon for more game jams. See you next time.